It began with a locked box, the kind the palace calls a red dispatch box, the leather case that carries the crown's most sensitive written orders from hand to royal hand. On a grey Tuesday morning at Highgrove, a private secretary placed one on King Charles's desk and left the room without a word. Inside, beneath a tray of routine papers, lay a sealed envelope bearing the late Queen's cipher, her personal royal mark, pressed into wax by a hand that had been cold for years. The king did not reach for it at first. He removed his glasses, set them down, and let his hand stop in mid-air, as though the envelope itself were a door he had hoped never to open. Because the document inside was supposed to have been destroyed, and that was the shock of it. King Charles had not prepared for the decree to exist. Camilla, who believed she had been promised everything, had not prepared for what it said. And Princess Anne, who had guarded the late Queen's final wishes for years, had not prepared for the moment when the truth would finally have to leave the shadows and enter the light. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The document that emerged from that envelope was not a letter, and it was not a wish. It was a decree, a formal ruling carrying the full authority of the sovereign, written in the late Queen's own hand and dated the final autumn of her life. A decree was not a request, it was a command that outlived the woman who gave it, because in the machinery of the monarchy, the written word of the sovereign becomes the settled instruction of the crown itself. The private secretary who had delivered the box had already vanished through the door, leaving the king alone with the paper. Charles read the first page once, then again, because the first reading had produced no sound at all, only the terrible stillness of a man discovering that the past had not been tidied away. The decree said 3 things. The first was that, upon the completion of the 5th year of his reign, the household of the consort, the private staff, the offices, the ceremonial machinery that surrounded Camilla's place at court, would be formally dissolved, and its duties folded into the establishment of the Prince of Wales. The second was that the custody of the private estates would pass not to the consort but directly to William, as the heir to the throne. And the third was that her annuity, her fixed yearly payment from the crown, would be reduced to a fraction of what she had been led to expect, and her cipher would be retired before the end of the reign. In plain terms, the late Queen had reached from beyond death and drawn a line around her son's marriage, and that line left the Queen consort standing outside it. Charles's hand moved to the corner of the page, where the signature curved in ink he knew better than his own, Elizabeth R., written in her own hand, in those final months when her handwriting had begun to slow. He turned the decree face down. He had ordered this document destroyed 2 years ago, and had believed the order carried out. What he could not have known was that a second copy existed, and the person who held it had been waiting, with the patience of a lifetime, for the moment when the king would finally have to answer for it. The decree was never destroyed, Princess Anne said. She stood in the doorway of the study at Sandringham in the grey afternoon light, her coat still buttoned, her voice flat as an account ledger. She had come unannounced, the way she had always come unannounced, because the Princess Royal had never needed permission to enter a room in which her mother's memory was at stake. I kept it. I am the custodian, the person formally entrusted with guarding it, and I will remain the custodian until you honor it. Before he could answer, Anne placed a single photocopied page on the desk beside the envelope. You gave the order to destroy it. The order was not lawful. A decree that has been issued cannot be unissued by silence. It can only be superseded by a new decree, and you have issued none. For Charles, this was not simply about a document. It was about the fiction he had built, that the marriage and the monarchy could carry on as though the late Queen's final judgment had never been written. Camilla learned the truth that evening, not from her husband, but from the sudden absence of warmth around her. Small things first: a footman who would not meet her eye, a table setting with an empty chair, the brooch she had worn to her first balcony appearance left lying on her dressing table as though a hand had carried it there and lost its nerve. She did not cry. She did not shout. She stood at the window of Clarence's house for a long time, watching the lights come on across the mall, and then she did a small thing that meant everything. She removed the small silver key from her handbag. The key to the private apartments at Buckingham Palace, the key that had been given to her as a bride of the throne, and she placed it on the marble table beside the door. The silence was more painful than any argument, because the silence said, "I understand what is being taken from me, and I will not beg." The fracture spread through the family along invisible lines. Anne's loyalty was cold and institutional, She believed the decree was the late Queen's last barrier against a future her mother had not trusted, and she would defend it even if it broke her brother's heart. William's duty was torn. He knew that the decree, if honored, would make him the instrument of his stepmother's undoing. And Camilla's humiliation was private, which made it worse. She was to be diminished not in public, where she could have fought, but in the quiet machinery of the household, where there was no audience to witness her dignity. It was Catherine who found the words. She sat with William in the small sitting room at Adelaide Cottage, long after the children were asleep, and said very quietly that the family had a habit of letting the institution choose for them, and that the institution never once chose love. Not because her title has changed, because trust has, she said. If you are the one who releases the decree, you will be the one who decides what kind of king you intend to be. William said nothing. He only looked at the photocopied page Anne had left with him, and for the first time that week, he read it to the end. To understand why Elizabeth had taken such an extraordinary step, the family would have to confront the evening at Balmoral, the private autumn evening, 2 months before her death, when only 4 people sat in the green drawing-room, and no aides, no secretaries, and no minutes were taken. The Queen was by the fire in the chair she had always used. Charles sat opposite her, his hands folded. Camilla was beside him, and Anne stood near the window with her back to the room, looking out at the D, as she always did when she did not wish to be read. The conversation had been gentle at first, the weather, the deer, the small mechanics of the estate, until Camilla, in an unguarded moment, spoke of the future. She asked whether, when Charles came to the throne, the management of the private estates might pass to her care, so that the family's homes and its treasures might be kept as I have kept them here. It was a single sentence, delivered in a warm and reasonable voice, and it changed everything. The room fell completely silent. The Queen did not answer at once. She sat with her hands resting on the arm of the chair, and when she finally spoke, her voice had the flat courtesy of a closed door. She said that custody of the royal collection, the paintings, the houses, the heirlooms held by the crown across generations, was not a gift a wife could receive from a husband. Custody was a trust, and trusts passed down the line of succession, not across marriages. The role of custodian is not a comfort, the Queen said. It is a sentence. You do not ask for it. You are chosen for it, or you are not. Charles had heard the warning in his mother's voice, and chosen not to hear it. He said nothing that evening, and his silence was mistaken by everyone in the room for agreement. Camilla believed the matter had been settled in her favor. Anne believed it had been settled against her. And Elizabeth, who had seen the whole exchange land exactly as she had expected, went upstairs to her study, closed her door, and wrote the decree in her own hand before the week was out. A renunciation, the formal giving up of a claim or right, can be demanded by a sovereign without a single word of explanation, and that is what the decree demanded of Camilla. Not angrily, not cruelly, but absolutely. The Queen Consort would hold her title. She would simply be given nothing of substance to hold it with. What William would learn from Anne's photocopy was that the Queen had written one additional line at the bottom of the final page, in handwriting smaller and slower than the rest. If this decree is suppressed, its authority passes to my heir, to be honored in his own time. The invisible hand of the late Queen had not only drawn the line around her son's marriage. She had built the mechanism by which that line would eventually be drawn. And the marriage was standing exactly where she had always known it would stand. The confrontation came at Windsor, in the private study off the state apartments, on a night when the tourists had gone and the corridors echoed with the weight of empty paintings. No courtiers remained, no officials stood ready. It was Charles and Anne alone with the decree between them on the desk where a supper tray had been pushed aside. "You kept it," Charles said. "It was not a question." "I kept my mother's word," Anne said. "That is what a custodian does. She did not write it to be burned. She wrote it to be obeyed. She wrote it in grief. She wrote it in fear of a woman she never allowed herself to know." "Then the fear was the judgment," Anne said, and the words landed like a stone in still water. "You married her against the world's counsel. You were entitled to do that. But you were never entitled to make the crown pay for your happiness. And this decree is the crown's answer, written in her own hand, before she could be talked out of it." Charles's voice rose for the first time. "You hid this from me for years. You let me believe it was gone. You let Camilla believe she was safe, and you said nothing." "I said everything," Anne replied quietly. "You chose not to hear it, as you chose not to hear it at Balmoral. I did not hide the decree, Charles. I preserved it. And now the choice has arrived that I have been preserving it for. Because tonight I gave the original to William, and nothing you say to me now will ungive it." The new line, the suppressed clause, hung in the air between them. The king had been outmaneuvered not by a rival but by a sister who had spent her entire life watching the throne and learning precisely how it thinks. "The decree cannot be buried," Anne said. "It can only be honored, or it will be honored by your son. Which of you will carry your mother's final word, Charles?" Because the crown could not survive if it was known that the sovereign's last command could be quietly discarded by the sovereign's successor. She did not wait for an answer. She walked out of the study, and the door closed behind her with the soft, final click of a decision already made. William sat with the original decree for 2 days. He read it in the morning, and he read it at night, and a third time at Balmoral, in the same chair his grandmother had used, while rain ran down the windows and the D ran grey below. The document was not simply a punishment of Camilla. It was a test of him. If he honored it, he became the instrument of the late Queen's judgment and the cause of his stepmother's quiet ruin. If he suppressed it, he became the first king of the modern age to bury his grandmother's final command and precedent. The long chain of past decisions that binds every future sovereign would bend around him. Charles asked for his signature on a letter patent, an official written order from the monarch, in this case a short paper dissolving the custody clause and folding the estates into the crown's existing arrangements. All William had to do was sign it, and the decree would lose its teeth, and Camilla would be saved, and the crater under the foundations would be filled with paper. Catherine found him in the study at midnight. She did not ask him what he had decided. She asked him one question, in a voice so quiet that he had to set the document down to hear her. "Are you deciding as a son," she said, "or as an heir?" He did not answer. He could not answer because the question had drawn a line through the middle of him. As a son, he loved his father, and he pitied Camilla, and he wanted the whole cruel apparatus to vanish so that his family could simply be a family again. As an heir, he knew that the throne is not inherited as a gift. It is inherited as a debt of continuity, and the first time an heir chooses private feeling over institutional truth, the debt begins to erode. He read the decree once more, holding the paper so tightly that the edges bent. Then he set it down on the desk, untouched by ink, and he said the only sentence he had said in 2 days: "I will not sign." He placed the letter patent at the edge of the table, face down, and walked out into the corridor where Catherine was waiting, the words she had given him, son or heir, following him down the hall, because a future king did not get to choose between them. He had to be both. The enforcement came quietly, the way all royal punishments arrive, not in a single dramatic scene, but in 100 small ones. The keys were the first to move. The brass keys to the private apartments at Buckingham Palace returned to the custody of the master of the household. The iron keys to the garden gates at Clarence House returned to the palace strong room. The staff moved through the suites of Windsor Castle in pairs, taking inventory of the rooms Camilla had once filled with her own furniture, her chairs, her writing desk, her photographs, and marking each item with a white tag. At Sandringham, the guest list for the Christmas gathering was quietly altered. The consort's name remained, but beside it, in the margin, in a secretary's careful hand, the word guest had been written and underlined. At Balmoral, her rooms were left untouched, which was worse than being emptied, because untouched meant unvisited. The great house simply closed its doors along the corridor, and the corridor became the boundary of her world. One broken protocol was documented with particular care in the court circular, the daily official record of the sovereign's engagements, the dry bulletin by which the palace has always let the public read its private weather. For 30 years the consort's name had appeared in that record beneath the king's, in a fixed precedence, the formal order of rank that governs who walks first through every doorway of the realm. The decree removed it. Her name was not struck out. That would have been noticed. It was simply omitted, an absence so quiet that only the people inside the institution could see it, which was exactly the point. The great officers of state, the ceremonial guardians of the household, received no written instruction. They received a list, and the list did not contain her. For Camilla, this was not simply about rooms or lists or keys. It was about the architecture of a lifetime. She had waited decades to be admitted to the center of the institution, and she knew, better than anyone, that the center does not announce its withdrawals. It performs them, in white tags and underlined words. She stood in the doorway of her own sitting room at Clarence House as the inventory passed, and she watched her life being catalogued as though it had already ended. She did not cry. She did not ask them to stop. She only touched the brooch at her collar, the one the late Queen had given her years ago at a family wedding, and then she turned away because the crown could not survive if it was seen to humiliate its own. and the cruelty of this particular punishment was that it could not be seen at all. But the decree had not merely redrawn the furniture of the palaces. It had redrawn the meaning of the word home for the woman at the center of it. And before Camilla could decide how to live inside that new meaning, she would first have to ask him one final question, the question she had spent her whole marriage not asking. She requested a private audience, a formal, one-on-one meeting with the sovereign, the oldest and most intimate machinery the monarchy possesses, a conversation that happens outside the calendars, outside the minutes, outside the court circular itself. Charles granted it without a day's delay, which was itself a confession. He arrived at Clarence House at dusk, alone, without aides, no private secretaries, no protection officers at the door, no officials standing ready to record the words spoken. The palace had offered Windsor for the meeting. She had refused. She received him instead in the small drawing room at Clarence House, where the furniture was worn and the light was warm, because she understood that the truth of what needed to be said could not survive a state apartment. He found her seated by the window, in the chair she had chosen, wearing the same brooch. On the table before her lay the silver key she had removed from her handbag the night the decree was revealed, and beside it a single sheet of paper, written in her own hand, face down. "Ask it," she said before he could speak. "You have come to ask it. We will not have another evening like this, Charles, so ask it." The question, when it came, was not legal and not political. He asked her whether she had known, before she accepted the crown at his side, that his mother had written a decree that would reduce her to a guest in the houses she had been promised. "The Queen Consort," she said slowly, "is not a guest in the palaces, Charles. The consort of the sovereign holds her place by right of marriage, by the crown's own law, and every room she occupies is hers until the crown itself says otherwise." She paused, and then she said the sentence that changed the evening. "I did not know about the decree, but I knew about her." The confession was raw, and it was controlled, and there were no tears, because for people of their age and their history, tears had long since been converted into something more durable. She told him that she had known, from the first night at Balmoral, that she had shown her hand too early. She had spoken of the estates to the Queen as though the Queen were a stepmother to be handled, and Elizabeth had answered by writing the decree before the week was out. "I knew what she did," Camilla said. "I did not know she had kept it. I believed, as you believed, that time would dissolve it. That is the thing neither of us understood about her, Charles. She did not forgive, and she did not forget. She just waited." She turned the sheet of paper over. It was a renunciation, the formal act of giving up a claim or entitlement, executed in the consort's own hand and witnessed by no one, because a renunciation witnessed by the palace would have become a public document, and she would not give the institution that satisfaction. She did not renounce her title. Titles, she said, were not hers to surrender. They belonged to the crown, and the crown could take them when it wished. What she renounced was something no decree could have taken from her: the claim to the private trust of the king, the expectation that her voice would govern his heart, that her comfort would come before the institution, that the marriage would outrank the monarchy. "A decree can take my rooms," she said. "It cannot take my marriage. But I will not let my marriage be the battle in which your mother's ghost defeats your reign. So I give up the battle, Charles. I am not defeated by her. I am choosing what she never allowed herself to choose." He read the page twice, the way a man reads a document he knows will outlive him. And then he folded it carefully and placed it in his breast pocket, the pocket over his heart. And it was that small gesture, more than anything he said, that told her what the evening had meant. "The decree becomes a dead letter," he said quietly. "I will not honor it. I will not dissolve the household, and I will not reduce your name in the record. And if my sister objects, then my sister will have to carry my mother's war alone, because it will no longer be my war." For Camilla, this was not simply about the decree. It was about the difference between the two documents on the table, the one Elizabeth had written out of fear, and the one she herself had written out of love, and the knowledge that, in the end, it is always the love that has to be the braver paper. But before either of them could believe that the battle was finished, the third copy of the decree, the copy neither of them knew existed, had already left the palace in the hands of a retired courtier who believed, with the certainty of a man who had served the late Queen for 40 years, that the document deserved to see daylight. And by the time Charles reached his own front door, the statement had already been drafted in the communications office, which meant that the family no longer controlled the story. The story controlled the family. The leak arrived in the morning papers, and the palace did what the palace has always done when the world learns too much. It issued a carefully worded statement. It was a masterpiece of controlled ambiguity. It confirmed that certain private arrangements concerning the future administration of the royal household, and the capital letters hung in the sentence like flags, were under review, in accordance with the settled wishes of the late Queen. And it expressed the hope that the family might be permitted to resolve these matters privately, away from public speculation. Every word was true. Every word was designed to conceal. And the concealment failed within 4 hours because the leak had planted an image that no statement could erase. The Queen Consort, alone in a small drawing room, placing a key on a table. Broadcasters interrupted normal programming. The evening bulletins broke away from their scheduled reports. The economy, the weather, the football, to lead with the single word that had begun trending across every platform, the decree. A crowd gathered outside the gates of Buckingham Palace as dusk fell. Not hostile, not celebrating, standing in the raw cold with cameras and phones raised, the way crowds always gather when the institution and the heart appear to be at war. And at the head of every bulletin ran the same headline, repeated in the same grave tone by every presenter, as though the words had been written by a single hand. The Queen's last barrier, Camilla left with nothing. The defining symbol of public reaction appeared at the railings before midnight. A woman, no one ever learned her name, and she was gone by morning, pushed a handwritten sign between the bars of the gates, a scrap of cardboard, the letters uneven and heartfelt. It read, "She waited for him, that was enough," and the sign became the story because it was not about the crown at all. It was about a woman who had waited decades for a love the world had told her she could not have, and who had watched it in the space of one winter be reduced to arithmetic. Broadcasters repeated the sign through the night. The image of 2 lines of ink on cardboard outside the gates of Buckingham Palace, the crown on one side of the railings and the heart on the other. Yet the greater shock lay in what the statement had not said, and the family, alone in their private rooms, understood this better than the crowds at the gate. The palace had confirmed the decree existed. It had not confirmed it would be honored. And between those 2 sentences, between the acknowledgement and the resolution, there was a silence that belonged not to the communications office, but to the king himself, who now had to decide, in full view of the country, whether the decree would be obeyed or buried, and whether the woman he had waited a lifetime to marry would enter the history books as his queen, or as his footnote. The final reckoning took place in the private dining room at Sandringham, on the 4th evening of the storm, with rain driving against the windows and the fire, at last, burning low. It was the room where, for generations, the family had worked through its wars over dinner. No advisers attended, no courtiers remained, no officials stood ready. The 4 of them, the king, the queen consort, the princess royal, and the Prince of Wales, sat as they had not sat together since the death of the late queen, and the empty chair at the head of the table, the chair that had once held Elizabeth, stood between them like a 5th and silent presence. Charles spoke first, and he spoke without the furniture of the throne around him. He admitted what he had spent his reign denying, that he had known his mother's disapproval, had carried it for decades, and had chosen again and again to build around it rather than face it. "I thought if I never read the decree," he said, "it would never be real. That was not strength. That was the cowardice of a man who had spent his whole life waiting to be king, and then discovered he had no idea what to do with the waiting over." He turned to Anne. "You were right to keep it," he said. "You were right to bring it into the light. I thank you for not letting me bury the truth under my own comfort." And then he turned to Camilla, and the room fell completely silent in a way that was more painful than any argument, because for 50 years this was the silence that had lived between the public meetings and the private partings, the silence of a man who could not choose her first, not once, not ever, until it was almost too late to choose at all. "I did not protect you," he said. "I promised I would, and when the promise was tested, I was not there. I cannot take back the document. I can only take back my part in it." He drew the renunciation from his breast pocket, the page written in her own hand, and placed it on the table, unfolded, so that all of them could see what she had written. Anne read the page. Her face did not change. It rarely did, but something in her posture shifted, the way the posture of a sentry shifts when the order changes. "She renounced her claim to nothing the crown gave her," Anne said slowly, "but to everything she brought to it." And then, in the quietest moment of the evening, Anne did something none of them had ever seen her do at table. She reached across and she turned the page face down, so that the record of the renunciation lay hidden, a gesture that said, in the institution's own language, that the matter need not be recorded. It was the nearest the Princess Royal had ever come, in her life of cold loyalties, to an apology. William had said nothing all evening. He had sat with the decree, the original, the one in his grandmother's hand, folded in his jacket, and he had not opened it because he no longer needed to. When at last he moved, he did not speak. He drew the decree from his jacket, laid it on the table between them, and then he did the one thing that had been waiting for him since the night at Adelaide Cottage. He pushed it, slowly, across the polished wood toward his father. Not torn, not burned, not honored, and not buried, simply returned, from the heir to the sovereign, with the choice left in the hands of the man who had to live with it. It was never mine to enforce, he said quietly, and it is no longer yours to hide. He rose and he walked to the window, and the rain continued against the glass, and no one in the room spoke for a long time, because the crown could not survive if it was seen to consume its own family, and every person at that table knew they had just prevented exactly that. Camilla was the last to speak. She did not cry and she did not raise her voice. She lifted the decrees, her mother-in-law's judgment and her own renunciation, the two papers that had defined the winter, and she set them both at the center of the table, one on top of the other, so that the decade of documents collapsed into a single stack. And the stack sat there, in the firelight, like the end of something. I will not be remembered for the decree, she said. I will be remembered for what I did after it. That is the only page I intend to write. And the room, which had been a battlefield, became a room again. 4 people, a low fire, and the sound of rain, and the monarchy, which had stood at the edge of its own abyss, stepped back, bruised but steadier. The document was never released. The statement was never corrected. The palace allowed the story to fade, the way the palace allows all stories to fade, with the gravity of an institution that knows the public heart is short and the crown is long. But something had changed inside the family that no amount of silence could undo. The decree had been returned to the king, the renunciation had been honored, and the consort had chosen the one thing the institution could not give her, her own consent. Power could protect love, but it could not make every private wish legitimate. That was the lesson of the winter, and they would all carry it into the years ahead, the way every generation of the family has carried its lessons, in private and without explanation. For Camilla, the reduced rooms became rooms again. In the months that followed, she was seen at the small ceremonies the court circular still recorded. The quiet duties, the charity audiences, the corners of the realm the cameras do not reach, and she performed them with a dignity that needed no decree to enforce. Deep within the palace, a new arrangement was confirmed. The household of the consort was neither dissolved nor restored in full, but scaled to a size that matched her role, and she accepted it the way she had accepted everything, standing without complaint. The photograph of the handwritten sign at the gates was reprinted for weeks. She waited for him. That was enough. And beneath it, in the archives of the palace, in a box that no one would open for decades, 2 documents lay side by side. The late Queen's decree and the consort's renunciation, the barrier and the surrender, kept together as the family keeps its greatest conflicts, in silence and in wax. The monarchy survived the winter. That was the quiet triumph of it. The king kept his queen, though not his certainty. The heir kept his future, though not his innocence. And the Princess Royal kept the late Queen's memory, though she had learned, in one evening at a dinner table, that memory is not the same as truth. Love may stand beside the crown, but it cannot stand above it. That has always been the law of the family, written nowhere and enforced everywhere. And it held, as it has always held, through the untidy business of human feeling that the institution wraps in velvet and buries in code. The gates of Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, Sandringham and Balmoral closed on yet another season of private war and public peace, and the country, as it always does, turned back to its weather and its work, unaware that it had watched, through the railings, the closest thing the crown has to a miracle. A family that had chosen to remain a family. And somewhere beyond the cameras, in the low evening light of Clarence House, a woman sat by a window with a cup of tea growing cold beside her, wearing a brooch she would wear for the rest of her life. She had waited decades to be loved in public. She had learned in a single winter what it meant to be loved in private. She did not look back at the palaces. She looked out at the evening, and she was, by any measure that matters, at peace. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.